I began volunteering in search and rescue during college. After school ended, I joined on as a part-time employee and stayed for a year until I got a full-time job. I'd spent the majority of my life in those mountains. My dad had been taking us there since I was 5, and I spent more time there when I began learning to rock climb at 13. It wasn't long before I began regretting my decision. I lasted almost a year at my new place, until I could fight the call of the mountains no longer. I contacted my old boss and he agreed to take me back as a full-time employee. It would be a sizable decrease in pay, but I was willing to take the hit. That would be where I would stay for 10 years until my first son was born and I was forced to take a higher-paying job in California. My memory isn't quite what it used to be, and therefore I figured that I better tell my most important story before it slips away forever. The story actually began a few months after I returned and would go unresolved for almost 15 years. It started with a report of a female hiker that had gone missing. Before setting off on her journey, she checked in with the rangers at the nearby station. They contacted us after she never returned. Within a few hours, we were all together, briefed and on the trail in search for her. Now, the search would go on for another 2 days until weather set in and stopped it. The weather kept us off the mountain for almost a week, and when we were finally able to return, the search had become more of a retrieval operation. I'm sad to say, even after almost a month of searching, we never found a single sign of her. Not a track, a piece of clothing, nothing. Little did we know at the time, this search would be one of many related searches for years to come. After that search, we would go on to have 3 or 4 more successful ones. Then, on a cold, foggy fall evening, we received a call of a missing couple. They had been registered to camp for a week, but after about 4 days were reported missing. Upon arriving at their camp, there were signs that someone had rummaged through their tent. Many of their things had been destroyed and possibly even stolen. It appeared to be foul play, and luckily some members of the sheriff's department had been training with us at the time. They were able to ensure that nothing was messed up during that search or anything we did would hinder the investigation or eventual trial. Just before dark on the second day, we discovered the couple. Both had been almost certainly murdered. The female appeared to also have been violated, it seemed, and the deputies took over the scene from there, so that's the extent of what I know about that case. Now, once the fall gave way to winter, things were relatively quiet until spring came along. A few climbers came up missing, but were quickly found safely. And when the first spring thaw came along, an unexpected surprise was uncovered. A group of men were out maintaining the trails as they did every year and came across a body of a young female. The situation was quite confusing as we had no reports of missing women in the park or in the surrounding area. As far as I know, that poor woman remains unidentified to this day. We had little time to regroup when another young woman came up missing. She had been camping with a group of friends and became separated from them at some point. We had been called in late in the day, so I had little time to search. By midday the next day, we came across her clothing neatly folded on a ledge. More than 50 feet below lay the Columbia River where she was assumed to have plunged to her death. Without any evidence to the contrary, her disappearance had been ruled that she had taken her own life, and that was the end of it. Or it would be until what came next. The next major search we undertook would stir up the suspicion that there may be a serial killer at work in that area. As was customary, when a couple did not check in with the ranger on their way out, we were contacted to begin the search. Naturally, we started at the camping spot. Strangely, there was no sign of their camping equipment anywhere. Considering there was a possibility that they'd moved on to another spot, we moved on further up the trail to look for a new campsite. 2 days passed and there was still no sign of them or their equipment. The third day would be when the body of the male was found wedged in a small cave. His body showed signs of foul play very similar to the bodies of other homicide victims we discovered in the last few years. Law enforcement would start to put things together. It was all they really had at this point, but it was something at least. Once the pattern was discovered, the local officials did everything they could to keep it quiet. They feared that this would destroy the tourism industry in which the area relied so much on. Even when it did make it out to the press, it was denied and labeled a conspiracy theory. Supposedly, most, if not all of the deaths could be assumed to be animal attacks. Few believed it, but it remained the official story until the killers were caught nearly 2 decades later. The press did have the positive effect of ending the disappearances. We all held our breath, dreading the next missing female or couple case to occur, but after a year, it looked like a spree had come to an end. After my time in search and rescue ended, I moved on with my life for the most part. From time to time, I would contact friends back home and catch up. The serial killings and disappearances never came up. Out of the blue, though, I got an email from one of those old friends. By now, over 15 years had passed since the crimes ended. I clicked the link, and what came up made my jaw drop. All these years later, 2 men had been arrested in connection with the crimes. A piece of clothing had been retested for DNA, and 2 separate samples were found. These samples were run through a database, and the pair were a match. Both were doing prison time for assaulting women at the time. And further down, the article claimed that one of the men cut a deal and confessed to his and the other man's involvement in the murders. Although the article didn't go into specifics, it was said that everything the man had said matched the evidence. The man gave the authorities the locations of the bodies of the victims that were not found up to that time. Unfortunately, not all of the bodies could be recovered. It had just been so long. It is assumed animals drug off some of the remains or weather washed them away. There was one curveball, however. The female, who was at first thought to have taken her own life, was then included in the murders, and it was not mentioned in the confession. There would be several more interrogations over the years, but neither man would ever admit to knowing anything about her death. As things stand now, it really does look like she took her life, even if her family and friends refused to accept it. Once the men were caught, the story was essentially forgotten. There were no trials. The men were given multiple life sentences, and the story slipped back into the past. Other than the families of the victims, my memories and those of my friends in the search team are all that made the story real. And now that I'm old and retired, and many of those guys from back then are actually long dead, it seemed that the kind and wise thing to do would pass these stories on to you. Now, people say the internet is forever, and I hope that's true. I'll be able to rest easier knowing those innocent victims' memories will live on way far longer than any of them could have ever imagined. They deserve at least as much as that, don't you think? If you enjoyed this scary story, listen to thousands more, either over on the Let's Read YouTube channel or podcast.